What does a second Trump presidency mean for the world stage? For the Russian invasion in Ukraine, it's a godsend. Trump has made it very clear that he will give whatever concessions Putin is asking for. He has not only threatened to pull full support from Ukraine and also be reimbursed for whatever US technology has been given. Over the course of his first presidency, he made clear threats that the US could just pull out of NATO, but NATO nations have made it clear that they can cover the funding for Ukraine just in case America decides to pull out or just sit this particular conflict out. Keep in mind, while the United States is by far the most powerful country in the world and the most powerful country in NATO, there are still very powerful nations like Germany, France, England, and the NATO economies would have to make a dramatic shift towards a more military-heavy one. The problem is, if Trump is actually in Putin's pocket, like many suspect, then he can pressure other NATO friends like Japan, Israel, Saudi Arabia to diminish whatever support they've already been giving. Then there's the conundrum that if Ukraine lost US support, the European countries in NATO would have to allow Ukraine to bomb whatever they can and to have whatever access to whatever weaponry they can. And we don't know if Trump will penalize NATO countries for doing this just to help give Ukraine a fighting chance. So if Trump's peace deal does go through, for Russia it means a victory because they get to keep all the land that they took in the war so far against Ukraine. Meaning that Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk are now Russian territory, and there is going to be a potential 800-mile buffer zone between Ukraine and currently occupied Ukrainian territory by the Russians. And this buffer zone will be populated by only European troops. Not one American troop will be supplied. And this has been a centuries-long Russian policy. In most recent history, you have Moldova, which was invaded in the 1990s, and then Russia said this is the last time they're going to stop. Then there was Russia's annexation of Georgia, South Ossetia in 2007, 2008, and then Russia said that was it, they were done. And of course, Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 was apparently, again, the nail in the coffin. Meaning we can expect more Russian incursions in Ukraine or all of the former Soviet states, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan later, Kyrgyzstan, maybe the rest of Moldova, Georgia. But before any further escalation happens in that manner, Russia will continue to undermine and sabotage NATO from behind the lines, like they've been doing for the past 2 years. Like they tried to sabotage one of those German bases not too long ago, and when they tried to assassinate the CEO of the German manufacturer Rheinmetall. This also means that Russia gets a near monopoly of all the oil and natural gas deposits at the bed of the Black Sea. This is the amount of territory that was once held by Ukraine before Russia invaded in 2014, and this is the current amount now. Which means that Georgia, Romania, and Bulgaria get to keep little pieces, and Turkey keeps the bulk at the bottom. And Turkey's President Erdogan is not very happy about that. There are a lot of fools who say, well, Russia's already the biggest country in the world. Why would they possibly want more land? Let's just go back to the map of the USSR, or at least Russia, including the former USSR countries. This was when Russia, or whatever republic it was at its largest. And they still attempted to annex more territory in 1979 when they invaded Afghanistan. For now, this is seen as a crushing defeat for Ukraine and one of the strongest gains that Putin has made in his entire presidency. For China, it's a bit more complicated than that, but the Chinese people are quite nervous. During Trump's first presidency, he set out a slow and deliberate bleed to the Chinese economy, which was perpetuated by Joe Biden, and it's looking like Trump may increase this trade war with massive tariffs. He enacted an average of 15 to 20% of tariffs on about $400 to $500 billion of Chinese goods, which was a devastating blow for them. Now Trump is suggesting up to 60% tariffs for the entirety of Chinese imports. While it can total up to an extra $2,000 a year for the average American household, it's going to be much more detrimental to every Chinese person, including Chinese manufacturers. But China's economy has shifted quite a bit since Trump first enacted this trade war. In response to those initial tariffs, Chinese factories moved to Southeast Asia, Latin America, most notably Mexico. China's also strengthened its trading relationships with the other Brics nations like Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and a dozen other countries. But it's not enough, especially because China's economy is still quite unhealthy. They are still facing deflation on their consumer and their producer end. Healthy consumer inflation rate is right here at 2%. Anything below that, it becomes a bit questionable. Well, China went into negative territory and they're barely above zero. That is not encouraging. That's exacerbated by the fact that they are still going through a real estate bubble in which about $23 trillion in local debt alone burst, and this is an $18 trillion economy. Their manufacturers have grossly overproduced, their inventories are full, and they have been trying to flood Western markets with their goods, but they've been blocked by massive tariffs from all ends. When Trump first launched the trade war, they were responsible for about 12%, but now China produces 17% of all global exports, meaning that they are even more sensitive to these tariffs than they were. Even worse for China is that Trump will use that country as a punching bag for its support towards Russia in the war, even though Trump will most likely be very amicable with Putin. Trump will be able to stir strong anti-China sentiment with sympathy towards Russia, and he can use this anti-China sentiment to get his followers, which is more than half of this country apparently, to endure what will happen to our economy if these tariffs and other trade punishments take place. Make matters even worse is that Trump is expected to name the biggest China hawk, Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, meaning that Trump can point a branch of government to do everything in its power to destroy or dismantle China's diplomatic grasp on other countries. Senator Rubio also wants to punish Americans who invest in China, taking away the tax breaks of capital gains for any investment into that country. A millionaire, instead of just getting taxed 15 or 20% of the capital gains rate, they would get taxed 37%. So yeah, China's going to be in for a very rough ride. Iran is screwed with a capital S. They're not getting out of it, even if they beg on their hands and knees. Israel's leadership is over the moon, happy as can be, because they can attack Iran as much as they deem necessary. And of course, the Palestinians are terrified. With Israel most likely being given free rein under a Trump presidency, Iran's proxies are now trying to call for peace. Of course, leadership in the West Bank as well. And Netanyahu's like, hey, the American people have spoken, and now you're all cooked. A commentator said, despite the destruction, death, and displacement that we have witnessed, what is coming will be more difficult. It will be politically devastating. And he couldn't be more right. 43,300 Palestinians dead. Expect that number to go up a lot in the next 4 years. Already, Israeli ministers are pushing for annexing more territory in the West Bank. Obviously. Israeli officials are saying the Trump victory brings opportunity. More specifically, brings an important opportunity for the state of Israel. Now it's being said the only way to remove the threat of a Palestinian state, Smotrich added, is to apply Israeli sovereignty over the entire settlements in Judea and Samaria. That's the West Bank. It's almost like that attack last year on October 7th was preparation for a Trump victory, because now Israel is just going to turn even more Palestinian land into a parking lot. And of course, new settlements for people of Jewish descent. Back to Iran. A few months ago, it was discovered that the Iranians tried to assassinate Trump, but it was foiled by the FBI. You think that Trump is going to forget this? Trump might make the U.S. military coordinate with Israel against Iran. It may be the closest threat to a regime change that Iran has faced since 1978, when the Shah fell. Iran's two main proxies have been nearly destroyed. Israel has launched successful airstrike after successful airstrike against the Iranian military infrastructure. And remember, Iran is another crucial supplier to Russia of sophisticated military hardware. Trump can be very friendly to Putin and Russia and give concessions while completely defanging Iran's military capability. As much as Trump admires Putin and Russia, he wants to take out China and Iran. And it sounds nice to some people, but remember, Trump may give such preferable treatment to Russia that he will weaken NATO. For those of you who don't know, it's the world's strongest and oldest multinational military alliance. Yes, I know, England and Portugal have had an alliance for over 500 years. That's just two countries. NATO is 32 different ones. The reason why we haven't had World War III is because NATO exists, because Russia knows if they attack any NATO member, then every single one of them will respond. But since April 4th, 1949, when NATO was officially formed, the USSR, or Russia, has been trying to dissolve it since April 5th. Unfortunately, our current president-elect has actually said that Russia should do whatever the heck they want to any NATO country that doesn't pay enough. And I'll admit, it is a great incentive for the countries that weren't paying their fair share. When Donald Trump said paying enough, that means at least 2% of their GDP spent on defense. First, let's look. Poland is number one. They are bringing it, 4.12%. Then Estonia, excellent. America, 3.38%. Here come the stragglers. Let's exempt Croatia. They're at 1.81%. They'll probably get there in a year. But the countries you'd expect to let someone else pay the bill, those are the ones. Portugal, Italy, Canada, Belgium, Slovenia, Luxembourg, they're one of the richest countries per capita. And of course, Spain. Fortunately, the only country really in danger of any kind of Russian expansion maybe would be Slovenia. The reason why I say potential is because look, Russia, Ukraine connected right here. Hungary, the president has pretty much spread his cheeks for Russia, and then here we go, Slovenia. Remote possibility, but a possibility nonetheless. And even if it's just rhetoric, it is something that will embolden the Russian government to try to take more land. And even the threat of weakening the world's most enduring military alliance that has brought about the most prosperous era in human history has set a lot of market pessimism across the entire world. Aside from inflation fears, people are worried about a new global norm, and whenever that happens, people start flocking to safe haven assets like the US 10-year Treasury bond or overall Treasury bonds. And look, the yield of the 10-year before people were pretty sure that Trump was going to get elected went from 3.65 to now 4.43. Same with the price of oil, which has dropped down to below $70 a barrel, which is always a bad sign. It's now at 68 bucks. A lot of this is due in part to China being the world's largest manufacturer. In fact, we call it the world's factory. And because of all the market pessimism, especially going on in that country, there just isn't a lot of demand to produce. There is also pessimism because of a new potential global norm. That's made even more notable by the rise in the strength of the US dollar as measured by the DXY index. When the dollar's DXY is over 100, that means the dollar is quite strong. When it's at 105.9, that means people are really worried about what's going to happen in the world. And if anyone is telling you that, wow, the dollar is going to crash, it's going to lose all of its value, just ask them the question, well, why are the world's major financial institutions and governments flocking to the US dollar then? India, they are the world's most populous country right now, and they are the 5th largest economy. Right now, the leadership has said they're not nervous about working with Trump, and I do believe they actually have some kind of amicability between the two. Up until the Trump administration, India had a pretty healthy relationship with either side of the aisle, and it helped both economies grow. India, much more so. When the United States went on a trade war against China, we imposed tariffs on steel, aluminum, and other metals. But we didn't just do it to China, we also did it to India. So India responded in kind. They ended up tariffing 28 different US products. And it was a really bitter tit for tat economy-wise. And in 2023, we saw at least 6 or 7 tariffs on both sides repealed, but not all of them yet. And India, rightfully so, is a little bitter about Trump ending the preferential trade status between these two countries, and it probably did help push India closer to Brics. Do you guys remember the whole H-1B visa crisis, where the visa rejections rose from 6% in 2016 to 21% in 2019? For those of you who don't know, Indians make up the largest immigrant demographic of our STEM trade. STEM is science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We have a shortage of Americans who can do this kind of work, and India has a surplus. So for decades, we enjoyed a very healthy exchange of this until the Trump administration. And it's great to gradually wean us off of this, but there's no way we can produce brilliant enough people in 4 or 5 years to be able to do the jobs that Indians have been doing their whole lives. Remember that India is one of our counterweights against Chinese expansionism. China is the 2nd largest economy in the world. They are the world's 2nd largest populace, and their interests don't really coincide with America's or the West's, obviously. Unfortunately for India, China is a bit of an expansionist neighbor where their army has constantly tried to launch incursions all along their border. India has built a very strong strategic partnership with the United States. Not necessarily an alliance, but they do get a good amount of military aid. In fact, it's the US military that helps India pinpoint when Chinese troops are crossing the border. And if we do want some kind of buffer to Chinese authoritarianism, then we do need an economically and militarily strong, which means we shouldn't be trying to strong arm each other. Now let's go back to the Middle East, focusing on Saudi Arabia and touching on their relationship with Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been at odds with each other over the centuries, but especially for the past 5 decades after the Iranian Revolution in 1978. No, this is Iran. This is Saudi Arabia. Sorry. Primarily because Saudi Arabia is Sunni and Iran is Shia. Both countries consider themselves to be the seat of Islamic power. Iran considers America the great Satan, and anyone who cooperates with them are kind of just bad. And of course, Iran wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, while Saudi Arabia is like, hey, can't we just be friends for now? The entire Houthi movement was started by Iran, or at least it was funded, because before this happened, Yemen was under the thumb of Saudi Arabia. Now it's the Houthis, backed by Iran, who control the capital of Sana'a. In 2015, both countries closed their embassies to one another. And up until 2019, Saudi Arabia kind of looked at Iran with impunity because Saudi Arabia is like, we are protected by the United States. What can you do? And then an Iranian drone hit a Saudi Arabian airfield under Donald Trump's watch. The first time in a long time, Saudi Arabia felt quite vulnerable, and they started trying to pursue peace or some kind of an agreement with Iran because they had a feeling that they could no longer rely on American protection, at least not to the extent that they were receiving before. No, Saudi Arabia still abides by the petrodollar deal because it just makes them so much money. Yet a few days ago, leaders of the Arab world met mainly to discuss what would happen between Iran and Trump with Riyadh. Riyadh is the capital of Saudi Arabia. It called on the international community to compel Israel to respect Iran's sovereignty and not to attack its territory. Saudi Arabia wants to be seen as having no part whatsoever in whatever happens to Iran with Israel, the United States, what have you, because they feel very vulnerable to an Iranian attack, especially because the Houthis in Yemen are still a threat to the Saudi oil fields. Some theorize that Saudi Arabia could be trying to position itself as an attractive and credible choice for the Trump administration to work with if Trump follows through with his pledge to broker a deal to end the war. While these countries will never really be friends or allies, they have reopened their embassies to one another thanks to a deal that was brokered by China, believe it or not, last year. Let's not forget one of the economies that we are most dependent on for our imports, Mexico. Mexico is our largest source of imports. We get 16% of them from this country. And the largest chunk of these imports are cars and car parts, which are manufactured in Mexico under American company names. Trump is threatening up to 25% tariff on these goods, which could lead up to about $1,000 to $1,500 extra paid per American household. But it would also severely harm the American auto manufacturing sector, just because we rely on these imports as manufacturers to be able to complete the assembly of our cars and buses. For those of you who don't know, Mexico has just elected a very leftist president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and she does not look too fondly on conservative policies, especially by the United States. Unfortunately for Mexico, we will have a red president and most likely an entirely red Congress by January of 2025. So whatever sanctions and tariffs that are threatened can most likely be carried out. And there is a chance, when push comes to shove between these two countries, Mexico will take a more favorable view towards China, who is already spending billions of dollars building factories in this country, and that growth may exponentiate depending on how we treat this key trading partner and ally. All of this put together does make it sound like the Brics nations, which aren't just Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but it's also Iran, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, a couple other countries, Egypt. It will make them try to lean on each other to depend less on the United States. It may force them to start trading their own local currencies to one another, but they won't be able to come up with their own currency for the sheer fact that none of them really trust any one of these countries to be their leader, especially Russia or China. When push comes to shove with any of these countries and their currency, nobody really trusts them to have the liquidity to match the US dollar. Looking at a pie chart of the world's top 5 largest pools of liquidity by currency, the US is 49%, the euro is 19%, the Japanese yen is 11%, and then we have other currencies right here, 5.5%. Chinese yuan is 5.8%. And China, the kind of main leader of Brics, will not let too much of their currency leave the country because they lose control of it and it can crash their economy. And it's more likely that these Brics nations will just fall over each other, not being able to choose a leader, or just stagnate. Now, I know that was a lot, and maybe I didn't mention some countries that you thought were pertinent, so if you have a suggestion, just let me know and I'd like to talk about it. If you found this post useful, you should join me on this. Just click this link on any of my pages, then click this link and sign up. Or at the very least, sign up to this. Thanks for watching.